So, if you hand a woman a survey, right, and you ask her to just describe her absolute ideal partner, the data shows she will almost always describe like the human equivalent of a golden retriever.
Yeah, loyal, sweet.
Right. Endlessly empathetic, totally safe. But, and this is the crazy part, if you look at the back end data of who she actually swipes right on at, 11:45 p.m. on a Friday night, she is frequently picking the wolf.
It's a massive statistical divergence. I mean, the disconnect between what people say they want on a sterile laboratory questionnaire and what they actually choose in a real-world high-stakes environment.
Yeah.
It's really one of the most fascinating behavioral paradoxes we have.
It really is. And we are going to look at the math behind why we lie to ourselves about love. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're cracking open one of the most fiercely debated, just myth-heavy topics in human history.
What women actually want in men.
Exactly. And just to set the ground rules for you listening, we are throwing out the poetic Hollywood romance tropes. We're throwing out the pop culture stereotypes. And we are absolutely entirely ignoring the rigid, highly cynical alpha male advice that just saturates internet forums right now.
Right, because none of that is based on empirical reality.
Exactly. Instead, we've got a stack of unsentimental, purely evidence-based synthesis. We're talking decades of hard data here. Speed dating field experiments, massive online dating algorithmic data, and long-term longitudinal relationship surveys.
We're looking at what the numbers actually say when you strip the emotion entirely out of the equation.
Which sounds a little cold, but it's so necessary.
Yeah.
So what is the foundational premise we need to establish right at the top? Like, what's the big aha moment of this entire synthesis?
Well, the biggest realization is that what women want, quote unquote, it doesn't exist as a static universal checklist.
Okay.
The data shows us that human attraction is actually a highly context-dependent, multi-criteria decision problem, and it's executed under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Yeah, I mean, it's an exercise in risk management just as much as it is an exercise in romance.
A multi-criteria decision problem under extreme uncertainty. I mean, that sounds like a quantitative hedge fund algorithm trying to price volatile derivatives, not a Friday night date at a local bar.
It does sound clinical, yeah,
Yeah.
but it's accurate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're going to treat attraction like an algorithm, we first have to figure out why the data we normally consume about dating is just so incredibly flawed.
Right.
Before we can even look at the specific traits like, the height, the jawlines, the money, the ambition we have, to look at what the source calls the measurement trap.
And the source material is highly critical of how we've historically gathered dating data. It draws a massive red line between stated preferences and revealed preferences.
This is a huge distinction.
It's everything.
Mhm.
If you don't understand the methodological difference between these two data sets, you will just completely misinterpret the reality of human attraction.
Let's get into that methodology then. What does a stated preference actually look like in practice?
Well, a stated preference is derived from a traditional survey or questionnaire. So imagine a psychological study where a woman is seated in a university lab, or maybe she's just sitting on her couch filling out an online poll.
Right.
And the prompt asks, rank the most important traits in a potential romantic partner.
Sounds simple enough.
It does. But in this environment, the responses are overwhelmingly influenced by societal norms, abstract ideals, and a psychological phenomenon known as social desirability bias.
Social desirability bias, meaning like she writes down what she thinks society expects a quote-unquote good person to want.
Partly, yes.
Hmm.
But it's also that in a vacuum, right, without any real-world constraints, human beings will simply list a utopian ideal.
Oh, sure.
Because there is zero cost to demanding a partner who is incredibly wealthy, devastatingly handsome, flawlessly empathetic, and endlessly patient. The stated preference is just a wish list.
It's the dietary survey illusion.
Exactly.
Like, if you hand me a clipboard right now and ask me about my ideal diet, my stated preference is kale, quinoa, and lean grilled chicken. I know what the correct answer is.
Right, you know the socially acceptable response.
Exactly. But if you subpoena my credit card statements, you will see that my revealed preference is ordering a large pepperoni pizza from a delivery app at midnight.
And that credit card statement is the exact equivalent of revealed preference data in attraction.
That makes so much sense.
Revealed preferences are derived from observing what people actually do when placed in a real-world market with strict constraints.
So not surveys.
No, we extract this data from speed dating events, from sociological field experiments, and from the massive granular data troves provided by online dating platforms.
Where the actual decisions are happening.
Exactly. In these scenarios, people aren't ranking abstract ideals. They're making concrete choices under the intense pressure of competition, extremely limited options, and severe time constraints.
Oh, wait, I want to push back on the implication here just a little bit because when you contrast the survey with, the speed dating clicker, it implies a certain level of deception.
How so?
Well, are women consciously lying on these surveys, or do they genuinely just not know what they want until the person is standing right in front of them?
That's a great question. And what's fascinating here is that the science indicates it's not deception at all.
Really?
Yeah, it's just the fundamental difference between an abstract ideal and a constrained reality.
Yeah.
I mean, when you fill out a survey, you're describing a person who practically does not statistically exist.
Right, the perfect human.
But in a real-world market, you are forced to make trade-offs. You cannot have the perfect combination of traits. So revealed preference data shows us how women prioritize when they are actually forced to choose.
Like, what do they compromise on?
Exactly. What do they compromise on, and what is the absolute deal breaker?
So they basically have to drop the kale and decide if they're going to compromise on a burger or a slice of pizza.
Well, let's expand on that analogy because the data actually complicates it even more. It's not just choosing between two available meals.
Okay.
It's choosing a meal while considering how much money is in your wallet, how far you have to drive to get it, and whether eating it will make you sick tomorrow.
Oh, wow. The variables are massive.
They are. And this is exactly why the source material stresses the absolute necessity of relying on meta-analyses and longitudinal surveys, specifically citing the German PairFam panel.
Right, the PairFam panel. Panel analysis of intimate relationships and family dynamics.
Correct. The reason we need massive meta-analyses is that individual, isolated psychology studies are notoriously flawed.
Because the sample sizes are too small.
Often, yes. A single study with, say, 50 college students might produce a sexy headline-grabbing finding like, oh, women prefer men who wear red shirts.
Right, we've all seen those articles.
But meta-analyses take hundreds of these studies, combine the data sets, and just crush those isolated anomalies. They show us what actually holds up across diverse global populations over time.
And the longitudinal aspect tracking the same people over a decade, that must show how preferences evolve, right? Because what causes someone to swipe right on a Tuesday on Tinder is probably not the psychological profile that keeps a marriage intact 12 years and 2 mortgages later.
It is entirely different,
Mm-hmm.
which forces us to look at how these choices unfold in chronological time. We cannot look at attraction as a single event. The data models it as a timeline.
A funnel.
Exactly, the decision flow chart.
Okay, let's walk through this flowchart for everyone listening, because the source material literally maps out the sequence of human attraction. And it starts with a deeply unsentimental hurdle.
The absolute widest part of the funnel.
Yeah, step 1 is simply market and availability.
Proximity is the dictator of attraction. I mean, who actually sees whom? You could have the most flawlessly compatible psychological profile in the world for a specific woman. But if you never cross paths physically in a city,
Or algorithmically on an app.
right, then you simply do not exist in her decision matrix.
Mm-hmm.
You are a non-entity.
It's the ultimate geographical and algorithmic lottery. But, okay, assuming you survive that, assuming you actually cross paths, we immediately slam into the second stage of the flowchart, the screening phase.
And the screening phase is brutal.
Reading through this data, yeah, brutal is the word.
It's exceptionally unforgiving because it relies almost entirely on immediately observable visual cues. We are talking about milliseconds of cognitive processing.
Just a glance.
Exactly. Apparent age, height, baseline physical fitness, basic sartorial style, and facial symmetry. In this specific phase, baseline physical attractiveness acts as the ultimate gatekeeper.
The gatekeeper. The common metaphor here is the bouncer at a nightclub, right? If you don't look the part, you just don't get in.
Right.
But frankly, that feels a bit cliche. Looking at the cognitive science in the sources, it behaves much more like an applicant tracking system, an ATS algorithm used by corporate recruiters.
That is a vastly superior metaphor. Walk through the mechanics of that.
Think about it. An ATS algorithm scans 1,000 resumes in 10 seconds. It's not reading your cover letter to see if you have a great personality or if you're highly loyal.
No, it doesn't have the capacity for that.
Exactly. It is literally just doing a crude binary search for specific keywords and formatting. If you don't have a bachelor's degree listed, or if you don't have the exact software skill it's scanning for, it automatically deletes your application before a human ever sees it.
And the algorithm doesn't know if you'd actually be a great employee.
It doesn't care. It is just trying to save the hiring manager's cognitive load.
That maps perfectly onto the evolutionary psychology of the screening phase. The human brain cannot deeply, empathetically analyze the complex psychological profile of every single person we encounter.
We'd be exhausted.
We would have complete cognitive overload and decision paralysis. So, the brain uses heuristics. It uses visual shortcuts to quickly discard options and narrow the field to a manageable number.
I mean, if you're listening, just look at your own behavior. Think about the last 5 people you swiped left on, or the last 5 people you walked past on the street without a second glance.
You didn't interview them.
No, you processed a visual heuristic in half a second and discarded them.
And this is where the nuance is critical. Because baseline physical attractiveness is the ATS algorithm. It is often necessary to pass the initial screen, but it is definitively not sufficient to secure a relationship.
It gets your resume on the desk.
It gets you through the door, but it absolutely does not guarantee you the job. Because once you pass that initial visual screening phase, the flowchart shows us that the path violently forks.
The great divergence. This is where the static checklist myth completely dies, doesn't it?
It does. Because the traits a woman looks for after the screening phase depend entirely on which path she is walking down. The short-term fling or the long-term commitment.
This divergence is arguably the single most robust, heavily replicated finding in the entire literature of human mating strategies, right?
Absolutely. Women's preferences are radically context-dependent. Let's examine the first path. The short-term, erotic, or casual context.
Okay, the fling.
In this scenario, the objective of the decision algorithm is to maximize raw attraction and sexual chemistry at an acceptable level of risk.
So what specific traits light up the board when the goal is to just maximize chemistry?
Physicality completely dominates the short-term matrix. Dominant social presence, extreme assertiveness, and a trait the literature refers to as sexual confidence.
Which means what, exactly?
It frequently includes pronounced masculine cues, a deeper vocal pitch, a highly developed muscular physique, a broader shoulder-to-hip ratio.
A classic alpha traits.
Exactly. These traits are weighted so heavily in the short-term context because they are immediate, visceral signals of genetic health, physical capability, and high mate value.
But the source note's a fascinating paradox here, because here's where it gets really interesting. You would assume that a quote-unquote casual short-term encounter implies lower standards. Like, it's just for fun, so people should be less picky, right?
Right. You would assume that, yes.
But the data reveals the exact opposite. Women are statistically hyper-selective for short-term encounters. Why is that?
We have to look at the evolutionary biology and the sociological realities of risk asymmetry. The cost structure of a casual sexual encounter for a woman is staggeringly different than it is for a man.
Let's break down that literal cost structure. What are the actual risks being calculated here?
First, physical safety. The size and strength disparity means any encounter with a stranger carries innate physical risk.
Which men rarely have to factor into the same degree.
Right there. Second, reputational damage, which historically and socially has carried heavier penalties for women. Third, emotional fallout.
Okay.
And finally, the absolute foundational biological reality, the potential for pregnancy.
The ultimate risk.
Yes, the biological cost of a mistake for a male is mathematically zero. The biological cost for a female is 9 months of gestation, significant physical danger, and years of highly energy-intensive resource allocation.
Wow. So the threshold for a short-term partner has to be astronomically high to justify those underlying massive risks.
Precisely. To override that deeply evolved risk avoidance system, the man must offer an overwhelming, almost intoxicating amount of raw physical attraction and dominant presence.
The chemistry has to be potent enough to temporarily quiet the alarm bells.
Exactly.
And this perfectly explains the classic bad boy paradox, doesn't it? The guy who is arrogant, highly assertive, maybe a little reckless, emotionally unavailable.
Yes.
He wins the short-term game because his extreme signals of dominance are misread by the brain as intense sexual confidence and capability. The chemistry spikes, and he clears the short-term hurdle.
Dominance reads as capability when the timeline is compressed to a single weekend. But watch what happens to that exact same psychological profile when we move to the other side of the fork in the road.
The long-term commitment co-parenting context.
Exactly. The entire architecture of the decision matrix completely flips.
It transitions from maximize chemistry to minimize risk.
Yes. The primary objective of the long-term algorithm is to minimize unpredictable risk and maximize stability, cooperation, and long-term compatibility.
So all those bad boy traits.
Suddenly, the thrill-seeking, the dominance, the arrogance, which were highly successful in the short-term funnel, become massive liabilities.
They backfire.
Entirely. In a long-term context, a lack of pro-social behavior, meaning a lack of empathy, a volatile or aggressive conflict resolution style, or inherent selfishness signals an unacceptable level of catastrophic risk.
To use our earlier analogy, the resume cleared the ATS algorithm, he got the interview, but the hiring manager realized he would absolutely destroy the company culture so he doesn't get the partnership.
That's spot on. For long-term commitment, the traits that surge to the absolute top of the priority list are reliability, pro-social personality traits, emotional stability, warmth, and crucially, a low tendency toward unprovoked aggression.
So it's about investment.
Absolutely. The willingness and the demonstrated ability to invest non-refundable resources, time, care, emotional bandwidth, and financial stability into a partnership take absolute precedence over raw physical dominance.
And we see this shift chronologically too, right? As people age, the data actually changes.
Age and life stage are profound moderators of these preferences. As women move through different life stages, the data tracks a clear, measurable shift away from prioritizing short-term physical cues toward valuing stability, emotional intelligence, and compatibility.
But physical attraction doesn't just disappear, right?
No, it isn't that physical attraction ceases to matter. It remains a baseline requirement. But its relative weight in the overall equation diminishes significantly compared to the traits required to successfully run the logistics of a shared life over decades.
Okay, so the dual pathways are clear. We have the short-term thrill maximizer board and the long-term risk minimizer board. Now, let's zoom in on the specific data points that blur the internet. Let's deconstruct the physical checklist. Bodies, faces, height, and voice. Because if I spend 5 minutes on a male self-improvement forum, they'll tell me I need a razor-sharp jawline and to be 6'4" to even exist. The rhetoric is incredibly toxic and absolute.
It is. So let's address body and fitness first, specifically the obsession with extreme musculature. The baseline data is straightforward. Physical fitness is generally a positive trait.
Sure.
In the short-term context, a fit body acts as a strong, reliable signal of health and vitality. It's highly sexualized. But as we shift to the long-term data,
Extreme muscle mass can actually become a negative. I'm looking at the source right now, and it explicitly states that being excessively hypertrophic, being too, quote-unquote, jacked, can lower long-term commitment prospects.
yes, it can.
But why? How does an intense dedication to fitness become a liability?
We have to view it through the lens of resource allocation and stereotyping. Achieving and maintaining extreme, hyper-developed musculature requires a massive, ongoing investment of time, caloric resources, and energy into the self.
Right, the meal prep, the 3 hours a day at the gym.
Exactly. Subconsciously, the long-term risk assessment algorithm registers this and asks, if this individual is dedicating 3 hours a day to the gym and micromanaging his macronutrients, does he have the remaining time, energy, and selflessness required to invest in a partner or a child?
Wow. It's literally an opportunity cost calculation.
It is. Furthermore, psychological stereotyping plays a role here. Extreme musculature is often statistically correlated in the perception of the observer, whether that's accurate or not, with higher levels of narcissism, impulsivity, or physical risk-taking.
Interesting.
So the brain registers the physique as visually impressive, but simultaneously flags it as a potential long-term reliability risk. It's a complex trade-off, not a simple more is better equation.
That makes profound sense. What about the face? Because the current online rhetoric dictates that unless a man possesses a razor-sharp, hyper-masculine, lumberjack jawline, he is genetically doomed to fail in the dating market.
The scientific trajectory regarding facial features is actually one of the most vital corrections in modern evolutionary psychology.
Really?
A correction.
Yes. I mean, facial symmetry and average proportions matter universally. They're the foundational indicators of developmental stability and immune health. but the absolute necessity of the hypermasculine jawline. The massive contemporary meta-analyses have shown that its importance has been drastically, wildly exaggerated. Exaggerated how? Because there were absolutely peer-reviewed studies published about this. I remember reading studies claiming that women specifically hunted for massive jawlines, especially at certain points in their menstrual cycles.
You are referring to the cycle-dependent preference hypothesis. For a period, there were numerous small, isolated studies that suggested during the fertile window of the ovulation cycle, women's preferences shifted dramatically toward highly masculine, dominant facial structures.
Right. The idea that biology just overrides personality for 3 days a month.
But this is where understanding scientific methodology is crucial. When researchers attempted to replicate these findings using massive sample sizes, combining tens of thousands of data points across diverse cultures, the effects largely shrank to insignificance or fell apart entirely.
Wait, really? The whole theory fell apart?
Largely, yes.
Yes.
The original studies suffered from small sample sizes, publication bias, and what we call p-hacking, where data is manipulated until a statistically significant result is found.
Oh, wow.
The modern synthesis concludes that a highly masculine face is not a stable, universal primary driver of attraction. At best, it operates as a minor supplementary signal.
So the internet echo chambers are agonizing over a variable that the meta-analyses have largely debunked as a primary driver. But let's move to the variable that feels impossible to debunk: height. The absolute holy grail of dating app filters.
The empirical data on height is clear and culturally ubiquitous. On average, women exhibit a pronounced preference for partners who are taller than they are. This is a highly replicated finding.
So the internet is right about that one.
However, the nuance that the internet misses entirely is the concept of nonlinear benefit.
Explain the nonlinear aspect. What are the literal numbers on this?
A linear benefit would mean that every single additional inch of height translates to an equal proportional increase in attractiveness, infinitely.
Right, meaning taller is always better forever.
But that is not what the data shows. The benefit of height operates on a curve of diminishing returns. Once a man is sufficiently taller than the woman, the exact delta varies, but usually a few inches above her own height, adding more inches, does not drastically increase his romantic appeal.
So the jump from 5'6" to 5'10" is massive for a woman who is 5'4", but the jump from 6'1" to 6'4" doesn't yield the same exponential return.
Exactly. The curve flattens out. In fact, at extreme heights, the data shows it can become a negative variable regarding daily physical compatibility.
But if the curve flattens out and extreme height isn't fundamentally necessary, why do modern dating apps feel like you need to be 6'2" just to participate in the economy?
Because the user interface of the dating apps fundamentally alters human mating behavior.
How so?
The apps provide a drop-down menu with hard numerical values. They gamify the screening process. When a user is faced with an overwhelming, paralyzing volume of options, thousands of profiles, they use the height filter not because biology demands a 6-foot partner, but because it is a highly efficient, ruthless market mechanism to cull the herd.
Wow.
It reduces cognitive load by artificially shrinking the talent pool to a manageable size.
The UI creates the behavior. That is terrifying. Finally, let's quickly touch on voice.
A deeper vocal pitch does provide a moderate, measurable boost for short-term sexual attraction, as it signals high testosterone and dominance. But again, as the funnel shifts to long-term commitment, the sheer pitch of the voice becomes vastly less important than the warmth, the prosody, and the trustworthiness conveyed through the communication style.
Okay, I have to stop and push back on this entire section.
Go ahead.
Because I hear the data. I hear you explaining that jawlines are over-indexed, height has diminishing returns, and extreme muscle is a risk factor. But step out of the lab and look at the real world.
Okay.
Look at who gets the most attention at a bar. Look at whose profiles explode on Tinder. It feels like there is a massive, gaping disconnect between this nuanced, highly rational data and the visceral, superficial reality of dating. If these traits aren't the most important things, why do they seem to completely run the world?
That pushback is entirely valid, and the source material addresses this exact contradiction using a specific cognitive and statistical concept: Mass artifact asymmetry. Measurement artifact asymmetry.
Measurement artifact asymmetry. We need a deep dive on how this cognitive science actually works.
It explains how our brains and our data sets systematically overvalue things that are easy and immediate to measure, simply because they are the only things we can measure at time zero.
Time zero, like the instant you meet someone.
Exactly. Consider how the brain processes visual data versus how it processes behavioral data.
Visual data is instantaneous.
Exactly. When you look at a dating profile or when you glance across a crowded room, what data is available to your optic nerve in the first 200 milliseconds?
Height, facial structure, shoulder width.
That is the only data available. Empathy is invisible. Loyalty is invisible. Conflict resolution skills take 6 months of high-stress observation to accurately measure.
Right.
Therefore, the physical traits artificially dominate all early-stage datasets and first impressions. But they do not dominate because they are the deepest, most foundational desires a woman has.
They dominate by default.
Yes, because they are the only informational inputs the cognitive algorithm has to work with in that specific fraction of a second.
We confuse first noticed with most important. We think because the ATS algorithm scanned for a keyword, the keyword is the only thing that makes a good employee.
That is precisely the illusion of measurement artifact asymmetry.
Mm.
It is a distortion of the timeline.
Okay, so if the hypermasculine physical ideal is somewhat overblown by visual processing heuristics and internet echo chambers, we have to tackle the other massive historical stereotype.
The idea that has existed since the invention of currency.
Exactly, the gold digger myth. The idea that women at their core are just ruthlessly optimizing for financial resources. Let's look at money and status.
To simply state women want money is scientifically imprecise and heavily influenced by historical lag. If we look at stated preferences, the surveys, it is true that women, on average across cultures, rate the importance of a partner's financial capacity higher than men do. However, when we transition to the revealed preference data in real-world environments, the effect size of raw income shrinks significantly.
Wait, why would it shrink? If I walk into a date with a massive bank account, isn't that a huge evolutionary advantage? It signals ultimate security.
It shrinks because raw income is invisible. Unless you bring your tax returns to the dinner table, a woman cannot visually verify your net worth. Therefore, resources operate almost entirely through proxy signals.
Proxies. So instead of seeing a bank balance, I see a Rolex or the keys to a luxury car.
Sometimes, conspicuous consumption plays a role, particularly in short-term signaling. But for long-term assessment, women rely on far more complex behavioral proxies.
Like what?
Education level, the prestige of your occupation, your vocabulary, your conversational breadth, your social network, and your general demeanor. These proxies signal not just current wealth, but the capacity to generate and maintain stability over time.
The capacity, not just the cash in hand.
Exactly. And this brings us to a massive socioeconomic shift that has radically altered modern dating. Assortative mating.
Assortative mating, meaning like marrying, like.
Yes. We have to look at how the labor market has changed the evolutionary algorithm. 50 years ago, in a single-earner household model where women were systematically excluded from high-paying careers, seeking a traditional provider was an absolute survival necessity.
Right, they didn't have a choice.
But in modern, developed economies, highly educated, economically independent women are very rarely looking for a pure provider to just pay their bills. They don't need a financial rescue.
So what are they optimizing for if not raw cash?
The data shows a powerful preference for an equal contributor, a peer. They seek someone of similar educational background, similar intellectual competence, and overlapping social milieus. They are looking for someone who can match their momentum, not someone to drag them forward.
So ambition still matters, but it's not just a cash output metric. It's more like, okay, let's say ambition is the engine of a sports car.
Okay, I like this.
It is intensely attractive because it demonstrates forward momentum. It shows you have a plan, you have drive, you aren't stagnant. But if that ambition morphs into a massive ego or you become a complete workaholic who ignores the relationship, it's like a sports car with no brakes. It has a ton of horsepower, but it's fundamentally dangerous and will eventually crash the relationship.
Actually, the data slightly complicates that analogy. It's not just that the sports car has no brakes, it's that the sports car is driving on the wrong track.
Oh, interesting.
Ambition is incredibly attractive as a signal of life management. But the net effect depends entirely on whether that ambition is cooperative or competitive.
What's the difference there?
If your ambition signals that you will abandon the family structure to work 90 hours a week for personal glory, the algorithm registers that as a massive negative for long-term commitment. You are hoarding resources for yourself, not sharing them with the partnership.
So it always comes back to reliability and shared investment, not just raw resource accumulation.
And we can prove this by looking at macroeconomics. The preference for raw resources is highly elastic. The data demonstrates that in cultures or time periods experiencing high economic uncertainty, high inflation, and massive inequality, visual cues of raw wealth become significantly more vital in mate selection.
Because the societal safety net has collapsed.
Exactly. When the environment is dangerous, optimizing for resources is not a shallow personality flaw. It is a highly rational, deeply evolved adaptation for survival.
But what about when things are stable?
Conversely, in highly egalitarian societies with robust social safety nets like the Scandinavian countries, the weight of financial resources drops dramatically, and the weight shifts heavily toward personality compatibility, shared values, and emotional intelligence.
That is fascinating. The economy literally rewires the attraction algorithm.
It does.
So if extreme physical traits are overhyped visual heuristics and money is really just a proxy for competence and safety, what is the actual holy grail? If we synthesize all this data, what is the ultimate winning combination of traits?
This brings us to the personality matrix.
Yes, let's get into that.
The central trade-off in the long-term personality matrix revolves around balancing two primary axes: warmth and kindness on one side, and dominance and assertiveness on the other.
Warmth versus dominance. How does the math work on those two extremes?
The source outlines a deeply unsentimental integration principle. Let's analyze the extremes. Dominance without prosociality. This is the assertive, highly confident individual who is simultaneously selfish, aggressive, or devoid of empathy.
The dark triad traits.
Often, yes. The data shows this profile carries catastrophic risk for long-term commitment. It correlates with high rates of domestic friction, infidelity, and poor resource investment in offspring.
That's the toxic bad boy. He clears the initial ATS algorithm because it's highly visible, but he bankrupts the company once he gets the job.
Exactly. Now analyze the opposite extreme: pro-sociality without self-efficacy. This is the individual who is incredibly kind, highly empathetic, very sweet, but completely lacks assertiveness, boundaries, or the competence to navigate a complex world effectively.
The classic internet nice guy. The one who complains that women say they want nice guys but then ignore him.
In the brutal mathematics of attraction, pure pro-sociality without underlying competence is frequently perceived as weakness.
Ouch.
It lacks the critical signals of protection, capability, and environmental mastery that are evolutionary necessities for long-term survival.
So neither extreme works. What is the optimized combination?
The winning profile requires the integration of both axes. The data shows that women consistently optimize for warm plus competent, confident plus respectful, assertive plus reliable.
Warm and competent.
It is the ability to be highly effective in the external world, while remaining highly empathetic and cooperative within the internal partnership.
It sounds deceptively simple, but balancing those two forces is incredibly rare. Let me ask you about a specific trait that always gets lumped in with warmth. Humor.
Humor.
If you look at any dating app, 90% of profiles say, must love to laugh, or looking for someone with a good sense of humor. Is this literal? Like, do I need to be memorizing stand-up routines?
It's not at all. Evolutionary psychologists have historically struggled to measure humor in a lab setting because it is highly subjective. But the consensus is that humor is not about reciting punchlines. Humor is a highly complex, multi-layered proxy.
A proxy for what? What is the brain actually measuring when we laugh together?
It is measuring social intelligence.
Yeah.
It measures conversational agility, the ability to read a room, and the capacity to accurately gauge someone else's emotional state in real time.
So it's about emotional attunement.
Very much so. In the short-term funnel, shared humor is the fastest indicator of cognitive chemistry. But in the long-term matrix, shared humor acts as a critical mechanism for conflict de-escalation and emotional regulation.
Meaning, if we can laugh during a high-stress situation like assembling IKEA furniture or missing a flight, we are proving we can survive a crisis without turning on each other.
Exactly. You are demonstrating that you can manage relationship costs effectively. Which brings us to perhaps the most unsentimental data point in the entire source material: the concept of fidelity.
Yes, the source frames fidelity in a way that completely strips the romance out of it. We usually conceptualize cheating as an emotional betrayal, a heartbreak.
But the data analyzes it purely economically.
How so?
It frames fidelity as the ultimate form of long-term risk management. From an evolutionary and logistical perspective, infidelity is a catastrophic systemic failure.
A systemic failure.
Yes, it heavily correlates with high domestic conflict, the potential introduction of pathogens, and most crucially, the devastating diversion of invested resources.
Because if a partner strays, their time, their money, and their emotional bandwidth stray with them. The original partnership is starved of resources.
Precisely. So an unsentimental reading of the longitudinal data suggests that many women are not optimizing for a cinematic, romantic idealization of love.
What are they optimizing for?
They're ruthlessly optimizing for low relationship costs. They want to minimize emotional stress, unpredictability, and resource drain. They are seeking a partner where the baseline operating system is safe, stable, and drama-free.
Okay, this is profound. We have reverse engineered the perfect profile. We understand the flow chart. We understand why height has diminishing returns. We understand that money is a proxy for competence, and the holy grail is warm plus competent. We know exactly what works in the real world.
Right.
But here's the collision course. How does this deeply nuanced long-term matrix survive contact with the modern, hyper-accelerated, glowing rectangle reality of dating apps?
It barely survives. In many ways, it gets entirely distorted. The final section of our synthesis examines the online dating amplifier.
Let's get into the apps.
We must understand that platforms like Tinder, Bumble, or Hinge are not neutral measurement tools. They are highly engineered environments that structurally amplify three specific phenomena: the absolute dominance of the first visual impression, intense hypercompetition, and deep systemic asymmetries.
Let's talk about those deep asymmetries. We have to address the gamification of swiping. Because the frustration for men on these apps is that women appear artificially hyperselective. The match rates are incredibly skewed.
The UI and the algorithm create a severe feedback loop. Because the cost of sending a like or a right swipe is functionally zero for men, the volume of incoming interest for the average woman is staggering.
It's just a flood.
It is a deluge of data.
Yeah.
This creates an environment where women are mathematically forced to be pickier. But the data suggests they aren't inherently more arrogant or demanding. They are rationing their attention in an overloaded system.
Right.
When you have high input, you are forced to filter heavily, and you filter primarily for immediate safety and quality risks.
You use the crude ATS tools available to cut the noise. And on an app, you only have two tools, photos and a short bio. Let's look at the specific app data. What does the science say about optimizing photos in this high-risk environment?
The evidence on photos is highly robust because, as we discussed with measurement artifact asymmetry, photos deliver the maximum amount of information in the shortest possible time frame. The data shows you need photos that are clearly well lit.
Well lit. Why would an evolutionary algorithm care about the aperture setting on my iPhone?
Because good lighting signals transparency. A dark, grainy, or heavily shadowed photo subconsciously signals hiding or deception, which immediately translates to a safety or trust risk in the female brain.
That makes total sense.
Next, you need photos that provide context and lifestyle data, a hobby, a social setting. It proves you are socially integrated and exist outside of your bathroom mirror. And crucially, you must avoid visual ambiguity.
Ambiguity, like the classic group photo where you can't tell which of the six guys is actually the profile owner?
Yes, or photos with face-obscuring sunglasses or heavy digital filters. In a high-volume, high-risk screening environment, ambiguity requires cognitive effort to decode.
And no one has time for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The rational response to required cognitive effort on a dating app is to simply swipe left and move to the next, clearer option.
What about the bios? The text prompts. Are users supposed to be writing persuasive essays defending their worldview to prove their intelligence?
No. The research shows that bios do not function through the actual logical arguments made. A dating profile is not a debate stage. Bios function purely as signals.
Signals of what?
A well-constructed bio signals cognitive competence, literacy, and social awareness. It signals values, demonstrating whether you are family-oriented or purely lifestyle-focused. And it signals humor and self-awareness, specifically without tipping into narcissism or self-aggrandizement.
And then we get to the actual interaction, the messaging phase. The data is absolutely definitive that sending a first message that just says, hey, or what's up, is a statistical death sentence.
It is functionally useless. Generic openings are rationally ignored under high-volume conditions because they carry zero informational weight.
They give you nothing to work with.
Exactly. Personalization, referencing something highly specific in the profile, drastically increases the probability of a response.
Let's look at the why here, because sending a personalized message isn't really about proving how charming or witty you are, is it? It's actually an economic signal.
That is the perfect distillation. It's pure economics. Messaging measures effort. And in the context of the dating funnel, effort is the very earliest observable signal of investment willingness.
So if you won't even try in a message.
If a man will not invest 30 seconds of cognitive bandwidth to write a specific contextual message, the woman's subconscious calculation is that he will absolutely not invest the massive, sustained effort required to maintain a long-term relationship. Hey, signals laziness, and laziness is a long-term risk.
Effort equals investment. Let's summarize the effect sizes of everything we've covered, because the source document provides a literal quantitative hierarchy for how these choices are made over time.
It does. For early choices, the initial swipe, the first impression, the casual date, the hierarchy, is heavily skewed toward the visual. Physical attractiveness and photo quality are vastly more important than height and status, which are greater than humor, which are vastly greater than deep personality traits.
Because, again, those deep traits are completely invisible early on.
Exactly. But then the timeline extends, and the entire equation flips.
It flips completely.
Yes. For long-term commitment, exclusivity, cohabitation, or marriage, the hierarchy reverses its polarity. Reliability, emotional stability, and investment willingness become greater than shared values, which are greater than baseline attractiveness, which is greater than pure resources.
The visual surface gets you through the door, but the pro-social foundation is the only thing that keeps you in the room.
Very well said.
What a phenomenal journey. We started this deep dive expecting a clean, binary blueprint, a simple X-ray of human attraction, and instead we mapped out a highly dynamic, shifting, multidimensional matrix. We moved away from the utopian myths of stated preferences and embraced the harsh, complex, but ultimately highly logical reality of revealed preferences.
We've seen that what women want is not a mystery, nor is it arbitrary. It is a deeply rational, highly context-dependent balancing act.
A tough balancing act.
It is a constant, rigorous negotiation between the biological thrill of short-term chemistry and the absolute foundational necessity of long-term safety, pro-sociality, and reliability.
And applying all of this back to the modern world, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay.
We now know, based on decades of hard data, that for long-term happiness, we fundamentally require warmth, competence, emotional stability, and high-level conflict resolution. Those are the invisible traits that actually predict whether you will be fulfilled in a decade.
Absolutely.
But look at our environment. The online dating algorithms, the primary gamified tools we now use to find love, structurally force us to filter almost exclusively by shallow, easily visible traits. The apps prioritize the visual gatekeeper traits at the exact expense of the deep prosocial traits we actually need.
It is a profound structural contradiction. We are perfectly optimizing our algorithms for the first impression while systematically blinding ourselves to the long-term reality.
So the question for you is, if the technological tools we use to find love are fundamentally at odds with the traits required to actually sustain it, are we optimizing our dating profiles, or are we systematically breaking our own dating markets?
It's definitely something we all need to reconsider.
Something to think about next time you find yourself endlessly swiping through the void. Look past the ATS algorithm. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We unpacked a massive amount of data, dismantled a lot of internet myths, and hopefully gave you a clear, unsentimental look at the actual architecture of attraction. We'll catch you next time.